This is a private club, sir, not a place you just wander into. Ethan Caldwell didn't raise his voice, but he didn't need to. The words cut clean through the marble entryway like a blade, sharp enough to turn heads from 20 feet away, sharp enough to make the couple near the velvet rope pause mid-conversation, sharp enough to land exactly where he intended. On the man standing in front of him, dressed in a plain black polo, dark jeans, and sneakers that had seen real sidewalks. Not country club terraces, and that man, Darius Cole, didn't blink, didn't respond. He just stood there as if the ground beneath him had claimed him, as if the moment itself had frozen around his stillness. The late afternoon sun casting long reflections across the polished floor, while a soft jazz track played somewhere overhead, now completely drowned out by the tension gathering in the room. Because everyone within earshot felt it. That subtle shift when something wasn't just awkward. It was wrong. And Ethan, mid-40s, crisp white shirt, navy blazer. The kind of man who wore authority like it was stitched into his collar. Took a half-step closer, folding his hands in front of him with that rehearsed patience reserved for people he had already judged. "Membership card?" he asked, though the tone made it clear it wasn't a question, and Darius finally moved. Not quickly, not defensively, just calmly reaching into his pocket and placing a matte black card onto the podium between them. The motion deliberate, controlled, almost surgical, but Ethan barely glanced at it, his eyes already drifting back up, scanning Darius from head to toe like he was confirming a suspicion rather than checking credentials. "Yeah, I'm going to need more than that," he said, and a faint smirk pulled at the corner of his mouth, subtle, but not subtle enough. Not when a woman in a cream dress just inside the lounge shifted her weight and whispered something to her companion. Not when a man leaning against the bar straightened slightly. Watching now, because the air had changed. It wasn't quiet anymore, it was charged, and Darius could feel it. Not for the first time, not even close, because moments like this didn't arrive. As surprises, they arrived like echoes, familiar, predictable, and for a brief second his mind flickered. Not away, but back to a different door, a different city, 10 years earlier, when a receptionist had smiled just enough to be polite before telling him the meeting had been rescheduled. Even though he could see through the glass that it hadn't, even though he had sat his car afterward gripping the steering wheel, promising himself that one day, rooms like that wouldn't get to decide who he was. And now here he stood again. Different door, same assumption, and still, he didn't raise his voice, he didn't correct Ethan, he didn't explain, because this wasn't about convincing a man who had already made up his mind. This was about something else entirely, something slower, something deeper, and Ethan, mistaking silence for uncertainty, leaned in just slightly, lowering his voice like he was offering advice. "Look, we get this all the time," he said. "People think if they act confident enough, they can slip through, but this isn't that kind of place." And there it was, not loud, not explosive, but unmistakable, the line drawn not by policy, but by perception, and behind them, a younger staff member, maybe mid-20s, name tag slightly crooked, shifted uncomfortably. Her eyes flicking between the card on the podium and Darius's face like she recognized something she couldn't quite place, like she wanted to say something but wasn't sure she was allowed to, while another guest near the entrance casually lifted his phone. Not obviously recording, but not recording either, and Darius noticed all of it. Every glance, every whisper, every subtle alignment of attention. But his expression didn't change, his posture didn't break, because he wasn't here to react, he was here to observe. And Ethan straightened back up, confidence settling in as he tapped the card once with a single finger. "I'm going to have to ask you to step aside," he said, louder now, just enough for the surrounding circle to hear. "You're holding up actual members." And the word hung there, actual, like a verdict, like a label, already assigned. And for a heartbeat, the room waited, the music faded into irrelevance. The polished surfaces reflected not elegance, but tension. And Darius finally spoke, his voice low, steady, carrying without effort. "Is that what you think this is?" he asked, and it wasn't defensive, it wasn't angry, it was measured, precise, the kind of question that didn't ask for an answer so much as expose one. And Ethan hesitated for just a fraction of a second before recovering, because hesitation wasn't part of the role he played. "I think," he replied, "that this is a private club, and you don't meet the requirements." And somewhere behind them, a glass was set down a little too hard, A quiet signal that whatever this moment was, it had crossed from routine into something else, something people would remember, and Darius, still standing there, still composed, let the silence stretch just long, enough to settle over everyone watching, before reaching into his pocket again. Not rushed, not dramatic, just inevitable, like the next move had already been decided long before he ever stepped through the door. Darius did not hand over another document, did not reach for identification, did not argue the point the way most people would when challenged at a door like this. Instead, he let his hand rest lightly against the edge of the podium where the black card sat untouched, as if even the object itself had lost relevance in a conversation that was never really about verification. And that stillness unsettled Ethan more than any raised voice could have, because it created space, and in that space the eyes of the room began to gather, not in a rush, but in layers, one guest leaning slightly to see past another, a server pausing mid-step with a tray balanced in one hand, the younger staff member shifting again as if caught between instinct and instruction, and somewhere behind the soft hum of climate control, the quiet murmur of speculation started to form, not loud enough to interrupt, but persistent enough to reshape the moment. And Ethan felt it, even if he would never admit it, that subtle erosion of control that happens when authority is questioned not directly, but collectively, when the room itself begins to decide whether it believes you. And so he adjusted, straightened his shoulders, lifted his chin just enough to reassert the role he knew how to play. "Sir, I'm going to say this one more time," he said, each word spaced with intention. "Step aside so we can assist actual members." And again that word landed, heavier now, reinforced by repetition, but Darius did not move. Not even an inch. He simply looked at Ethan with a calm that did not challenge and did not submit, a kind of patience. That suggested time was not working against him, but for him. And that was the part Ethan could not read, the part that made this interaction different from the dozens he had handled before, because usually there was a crack by now, a defensive tone, a frustrated sigh, something to confirm the narrative he had already written, but here there was nothing, just composure, and behind that composure something else, something quieter but stronger, and the younger staff member finally spoke, her voice. Hesitant, but clear enough to be heard. "Maybe we should just check the system again," she said, her eyes flicking briefly to the card and then back to Ethan, and the suggestion hung there, small but significant, a thread of doubt introduced into a situation that had been presented as certain, and Ethan's expression tightened almost imperceptibly before he turned his head toward her, not sharply, but with the kind of controlled disapproval that did not need to be loud to be effective. "I have already handled it," he replied. And that was the end of that, at least for her, because she stepped back immediately, the weight of hierarchy pressing her silence back into place. But the idea had already escaped. It had already reached the ears of the guests who were now watching more openly. And one of them, a man in a tailored gray suit near the entrance, spoke under his breath to his companion. "This does not look right." And though he did not intend for anyone else to hear it, the words carried just enough to add to the shifting current in the room, and Darius noticed that too, not with satisfaction, not with urgency, just with awareness, because this was the pattern, this was how it always unfolded, when people were given just enough time to see clearly. And he let that time expand, let the moment breathe, before finally reaching into his pocket again, not quickly, not dramatically, just with the same measured control he had maintained from the beginning. And this time when his hand emerged, it held a phone, sleek, unremarkable, the kind of device that did not draw attention until it was used, and Ethan's eyes dropped to it for a fraction of a second before returning to Darius's face, a flicker of irritation passing through his expression as if this confirmed his expectation that the situation was about to become performative. "If you are planning to record this, I'll have to ask you to stop," he said, the authority in his voice sharpening slightly, because now he felt something he could categorize, something he could respond to. But Darius shook his head once slowly. "No," he said, his voice still even. "I do not need a recording." And that answer did not resolve anything. It complicated it, because it removed the assumption that this was about attention or spectacle, and left something else in its place, something less familiar to Ethan, something that did not fit into the usual script, and for a brief moment, the manager hesitated again. Not outwardly, not enough for most people to notice, but enough that the rhythm of his control slipped just slightly, and Darius, without looking away, tapped the screen of his phone once, then lifted it to his ear with the same calm precision he had shown in every movement so far. And when he spoke, he did not raise his voice. He did not turn away. He did not step aside. He simply said, "This is Darius," and paused, just long enough for the words to settle. "I need you to review active authority permissions at the downtown club location." And the phrasing was specific, structured, not emotional, but procedural, the kind of language that did not belong to someone trying to get in, but to someone who understood exactly how access worked. And Ethan heard it, and something in his expression shifted, not fully, not yet, but enough to register, because that was not the language of a guest arguing at a door. That was the language of someone operating from a different level entirely. And around them the room seemed to hold its breath, the earlier murmurs fading into a quieter, more focused silence, as if everyone present sensed that whatever this moment had been, it was no longer contained at the entrance. It was moving somewhere else, somewhere deeper, and Darius, still standing exactly where he had been from the start, listened for a second, then added one more line, just as steady, just as precise, "Yes, I will wait," and lowered the phone slightly, not ending the call, just holding it there, as if the next move did not belong to him alone anymore. The word "wait" did not sound passive when Darius said it. It sounded deliberate, like time itself had been placed on his side of the table. And that subtle shift was not lost on the people watching, because the energy at the entrance had changed again, no longer just tension, but anticipation, the kind that builds when something unseen begins to move beneath the surface, and Ethan felt it pressing against him, even as he tried to maintain the same controlled posture, the same measured authority that had carried him through every similar interaction before. But this was not following the usual script. And the longer Darius stood there without reacting, without defending himself, the more that script began to unravel, because control depends on response. And there was none to manage, only silence and precision, and behind Ethan, the glass doors leading into the main lounge reflected the scene like a mirror that could not be ignored, capturing every glance, every shift, every second that stretched just a little too long. And the younger staff member who had spoken earlier now looked at the screen of the check-in terminal again, her fingers hovering just above the keys as if she was waiting for permission that was not coming, while a guest near the entrance took a slow step closer, not intruding, just positioning himself within clearer view, curiosity overriding etiquette, and somewhere to the side a quiet voice whispered, "He is not nervous." And that observation landed differently than the earlier ones, because it was not about what Darius lacked. It was about what he held, and Ethan heard it, whether he wanted to or not, and it pushed him to act, to reclaim ground that felt like it was slipping inch by inch. So he reached for the black heart on the podium and lifted it between two fingers, examining it now with more attention than before, turning it slightly as if searching for a flaw, for something that would restore certainty. "You know," he said, his tone tightening just enough to reveal the strain beneath it. "These are easy to replicate," and he tapped the edge of the card lightly against the surface, a small gesture meant to dismiss its significance. But it did not land the way he expected, because the room was no longer listening for his conclusions. It was watching for what would happen next. And Darius, still holding the phone near his ear, did not look at the card, did not acknowledge the comment. He simply listened, his gaze steady, his posture unchanged. And then he spoke again, not to Ethan, but into the phone, confirmed the name attached to executive oversight for this location. He said, his voice as even as before, and the phrasing drew a reaction this time. Not from Darius, but from the people around them, because it sounded official in a way that could not be easily dismissed, and Ethan felt it immediately, the weight of those words settling into the space between them. And for the first time, his confidence did not expand to fill it. It hesitated, and that hesitation was enough, because the younger staff member looked up again, her eyes widening just slightly, as if something in the system had caught her attention, something she had not expected to see, and she glanced at Ethan, then back at the screen, then at Darius, caught in a moment where information and authority were no longer aligned, and she took a breath as if to speak, then stopped, the tension of hierarchy still holding her in place, while a man standing a few feet away crossed his arms and said quietly, "Maybe you should check that." And this time the suggestion did not feel like an interruption, it felt like a correction, and Ethan's grip on the card tightened almost imperceptibly before he set it back down on the podium with more force than necessary. Not aggressive, but definitive, as if placing an object could also place him into doubt. "I have already handled it," he repeated, but the words sounded different now, less certain, more rehearsed, and Darius lowered the phone slightly, just enough to speak clearly while still holding the call. "That is what I am verifying," he said, and there was no challenge in it, no accusation, just a statement that shifted the frame entirely, because now it was not about whether he belonged, it was about whether the system had been used correctly, and that was a different conversation, one that did not rely on appearance or assumption, one that required accuracy, and accuracy was not something Ethan could control in real time, not without cooperation from the system he claimed to represent, and that realization moved through him quickly. Though he tried to mask it, his posture stiffening, his expression narrowing as if focus alone could restore the authority, he felt slipping. But the room had already begun to move, not physically, but collectively, attention aligning with Darius rather than him, waiting not for a command, but for a result, and Darius, after a brief pause, nodded once, as if acknowledging something only he could hear, then spoke into the phone again. "Good," he said, the word quiet but precise. "Now, pull active permissions tied to the current manager on duty," and that was the moment everything shifted, not loudly, not dramatically, but undeniably, because the language had crossed a line from access to authority, from entry to control, and even Ethan could not ignore it now. The implication settling in as his eyes flicked from Darius to the phone and back again, searching for something he could still claim as certain, but finding less with each passing second, and the room, once tense, now felt like it was leaning forward, every person present aware that whatever was about to happen next would not just resolve the moment, it would redefine it entirely. The word authority did not echo loudly, but it settled into the room with a weight that no one could ignore, and for the first time since this moment began, Ethan Caldwell did not speak immediately. He did not redirect, did not assert control. He simply stood there with a stillness that looked almost like composure, but felt very different, because this was not chosen silence. This was hesitation, and the difference was visible to anyone paying attention, especially the younger staff member whose eyes were now fixed on the screen in front of her, her posture tightening as lines of information refreshed, updating in real time as if the system itself had begun to respond to something beyond the front desk, and she swallowed before finally speaking again, her voice quieter than before, but more certain. "Ethan, there's a flag on the account," she said, and the word flag carried a different kind of weight, not emotional, not subjective, but procedural, and that made it harder to dismiss, harder to control, and Ethan turned toward her with a sharpness that he could no longer fully soften, then clear it. He replied quickly, the response automatic, practiced, but she did not move right away, and that pause said more than any explanation could, because it meant the system was not offering a simple correction. It was presenting something that required attention, something that could not be overridden with confidence alone, and Darius remained exactly where he was, the phone still in his hand, his gaze steady, not watching Ethan now, but watching the space as a whole, as if the moment belonged to everyone present and not just the two of them. And in that shared space, the shift became undeniable, because the guests were no longer pretending not to notice. They were watching openly now. Conversations paused, attention focused, the earlier whispers replaced by a quiet that felt intentional, as if the room itself had decided to witness whatever came next. And Darius spoke again into the phone, his tone unchanged. "Read it back to me," he said, and there was a brief pause, just long enough for anticipation to settle deeper into the air, before he nodded slightly. "Understood," he added, and lowered the phone just enough to let his next words land clearly. not as an announcement, but as a continuation of the process already in motion. It appears there is a discrepancy between assigned authority and executed actions at this location, he said, and the phrasing was precise, almost clinical, but the implication was anything but neutral because it reframed the entire situation, not as a question of entry, but as a question of management. And Ethan felt that shift immediately, his jaw tightening, his stance adjusting as if he could physically hold his position in place. There is no discrepancy, he said, more quickly than before, more forcefully, but the confidence that once anchored his words was beginning to thin, and the younger staff member looked at him again, her expression caught between uncertainty and realization. It is showing restricted permissions being exceeded, she added, and this time her voice did not waver. Because the screen in front of her was no longer ambiguous. It was clear, and clarity has a way of removing doubt, not just for the person reading it, but for everyone who hears it. And a guest near the entrance let out a quiet breath, not dramatic, not loud, but enough to signal that something had changed, something had crossed from suspicion into confirmation, and Darius, still composed, still steady, let the moment settle before speaking again, not to challenge, not to confront, but to finalize, proceed with temporary suspension of active authority pending review, he said into the phone. And the words moved through the room like a current, because they were not emotional, they were operational, and that made them real in a way that no argument could match. And Ethan's eyes snapped back to Darius, searching, calculating, try to place him, to understand how a man he had dismissed minutes earlier was now speaking in terms that affected the structure he managed. And for a brief second, the two men stood in silence again, but this silence was different. It was no longer controlled by Ethan. It was shaped by uncertainty, and uncertainty does not hold power. It loses it, piece by piece, as the room begins to align with whatever feels more certain. And right now, that certainty was not coming from the podium. It was coming from the man who had not moved since he arrived. And then it happened, not with a shout, not with a visible signal, but with a sound so small it almost went unnoticed. A soft notification tone from the terminal in front of the younger staff member. And she looked down instinctively, her eyes scanning the screen as something updated again, something final this time. And she froze for a fraction of a second before looking up at Ethan. Her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying across the silence with absolute clarity. "Your access just changed," she said. And the words did not need to be repeated, did not need to be explained, because everyone in the room understood what they meant, even before Ethan fully processed them, even before he turned toward the screen himself, even before he realized that whatever authority he thought he had been protecting at that door had already begun to slip out of his hands. The words "your access just changed" did not echo. They did not need to, because the silence that followed carried them further than any raised voice could have, and Ethan Caldwell felt it before he fully understood it. That subtle but undeniable shift where authority no longer flowed through him, but around him, bypassing him entirely, as if the system he relied on had quietly recalibrated without his consent. And for the first time since this began, he looked at the screen instead of the man in front of him, his eyes scanning, searching, trying to find something that still confirmed his position, something that still made sense. But the display did not argue. It did not negotiate. It simply presented the change as fact, and facts do not bend to tone or posture. And the younger staff member stepped back slightly, giving space not out of fear but out of recognition, because what she was witnessing was not a disagreement anymore. It was a transition, and transitions do not ask permission. They happen, and around them the room absorbed it in layers. A guest lowering his phone slowly, as if the need to record had been replaced by the need to understand. Another shifting his stance, no longer observing casually but fully engaged, because the dynamic had flipped in a way that was both subtle and undeniable. And Darius Cole, still exactly where he had been from the start, did not move to claim the moment, did not step forward or raise his voice. He simply watched, calm and composed, as if this outcome had never been in question, as if the only variable had been how long it would take for everyone else to see it. And Ethan finally spoke, but the words came slower now, less certain. "There must be some kind of error," he said, And even as he said it, the sentence felt thinner than the ones he had used before, because it was no longer supported by the same confidence. And the younger staff member shook her head slightly. Not dismissive, just honest. "It is not an error," she replied, her eyes still on the screen. "Permissions are being reassigned in real time." And that phrase landed differently than anything before it, because it confirmed what the room had already begun to feel, that this was not a misunderstanding, it was a correction, and corrections do not negotiate with assumptions. They replace them. And Darius lifted the phone back to his ear, listening for a brief moment before speaking again, his voice steady, controlled. "Yes, proceed with full audit on front desk. Activity for the past hour," he said, and there was no urgency in it, no anger, just clarity, the kind that comes from knowing exactly where you stand within a system. And Ethan heard that too, and this time he could not ignore it, because the language was no longer abstract, it was specific, targeted, directed at the exact position he occupied. And for a brief second something passed across his face. Not quite panic, not quite disbelief, but something closer to realization, the kind that arrives when a narrative collapses all at once instead of gradually. And he looked at Darius again, really looked this time, not scanning, not judging, but searching, as if trying to reconcile the man in front of him with the authority now moving through the system. And the room watched that shift happen in real time. The moment when perception catches up to reality, when assumptions fall away and something clearer takes their place. And a guest near the entrance spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, but loud enough to be heard. He knew the whole time, and the statement settled into the space like a conclusion, because it explained everything without needing confirmation, and Darius did not respond to it, did not acknowledge it, because he did not need to. His silence had already said enough. And Ethan straightened slightly, as if trying to recover some version of control, but the posture no longer carried the same weight, because authority without system support is just appearance, and appearance had already been proven unreliable. And he glanced at the screen again, then back at Darius, and finally asked the question he had avoided from the beginning, his voice quieter now, stripped of its earlier certainty. "Who are you?" he said, and the room held still again, not tense this time, but focused, because this was the moment where everything aligned, the question that should have been asked at the start, but was not, the question that now carried more weight than it ever could have earlier. And Darius lowered the phone from his ear, not ending the call, just letting it rest in his hand as he looked directly at Ethan, his expression unchanged, his tone calm. But there was something different now, not louder, not sharper, just clearer. "I am the reason that system exists," he said. And the sentence did not need elaboration, did not need explanation, because it reframed the entire interaction in a single line, and the room absorbed it in silence. The kind of silence that does not come from confusion, but from understanding, because everything that had happened over the past several minutes now made sense in a way it had not before. And Ethan stood there with that realization settling in, piece by piece, as the structure he had relied on revealed itself to belong not to him, but to the man he had just tried to turn away. The sentence did not raise the volume in the room, but it lowered everything else, every whisper, every shifting footstep, every quiet assumption that had been building since the moment Darius walked in. And now there was nothing left to fill the space except the truth of what he had just said, and Ethan Caldwell felt it settle in with a weight he could not redirect. Because this was not a misunderstanding anymore. It was exposure, the kind that does not shout, but simply reveals what has already been done. And for a moment he said nothing, his posture still upright, but no longer anchored, his confidence no longer supported by the system he had relied on just minutes ago. And the younger staff member glanced between them, her expression no longer uncertain, but resolved, because what she was seeing now aligned with what she had felt earlier, that something about this interaction had been wrong from the start. And now that wrong had a shape, a cause, and a consequence, and Darius did not move forward, did not claim space or attention. He simply stood there with the same calm presence, letting the reality of the situation unfold without interference. Because control was no longer something he needed to assert, it was something already in motion. And he lifted the phone back to his ear again, listening briefly before speaking with the same measured clarity. Proceed with revoking temporary privileges issued under Caldwell's authorization for the past 30 minutes, he said, and the specificity of the instruction carried through the room like a quiet signal, because it was no longer abstract, it was targeted, precise, and immediate, and Ethan's eyes shifted again toward the screen, his breathing just slightly uneven now, not dramatic, not obvious, but enough to betray the shift happening beneath the surface, because authority being questioned is one thing. Authority being removed in real time is something else entirely. And the terminal chimed again, soft but unmistakable. Another update, another adjustment, another layer of control moving away from him, and the younger staff member spoke without hesitation this time, her voice steady. Guest overrides just reset, she said, and the phrase might have sounded technical to someone outside the system. But in that moment, it meant something very simple. The power to decide who belonged had just been taken away from the person who had been using it, and the room understood that, not in exact terms, but in outcome, and a quiet ripple moved through the guests, not loud, not disruptive, just a shared recognition that the moment had turned completely, and Ethan finally stepped back half an inch, a movement so small it might have gone unnoticed if not for what it represented, because he was no longer holding the line, he was adjusting to it, and Darius lowered the phone once more, his gaze steady, his tone unchanged. You said I did not meet the requirements, he said, not as a challenge, not as an accusation, but as a statement being revisited, and Ethan did not answer immediately, because the words he had used earlier no longer fit the reality in front of him, and silence stretched between them again, but this time it did not belong to uncertainty, it belonged to consequence, and Darius continued, his voice calm but precise. The issue was never the requirements, he said, it was how you decided to apply them. And that line landed deeper than anything before it, because it did not just address the moment, it defined it. It pulled back the surface and revealed the pattern underneath, the assumption, the judgment, the decision made before any verification had even been attempted, and the younger staff member looked down at the screen again, then back up, as if confirming something she already knew, and one of the guests near the entrance nodded slowly, not to anyone in particular, just acknowledging what had become clear to everyone watching, and Darius turned slightly, not away, but just enough to include the room in his presence, his voice still even, still controlled. Policies are not the problem, he said, people are, and the words did not accuse, they defined, and that made them impossible to ignore, and Ethan swallowed, his expression shifting again, no longer defensive, no longer certain, just aware that the position he had stood in moments ago no longer existed the way he believed it did, and Darius lifted the phone one last time, listening for a brief moment before giving a final instruction. Complete the review and lock the account until reassignment is confirmed, he said. And with that, the process was no longer unfolding. It was concluding, the system moving toward resolution with the same quiet efficiency it had shown from the beginning, and Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket, returning to stillness, the same stillness he had held since the moment he arrived, but now it carried a different weight, not quiet resistance, but established authority, and he looked at Ethan one final time, not with anger, not with triumph, but with clarity. You were not protecting this place, he said. You were limiting it. And the distinction settled into the room like a final line, the kind that does not need repetition because everyone present had already seen it play out in real time, and there was nothing left to argue, nothing left to defend, only the reality of what had just been revealed and the quiet understanding that followed it. The room did not erupt, it did not react with noise or chaos. Instead, it settled into something heavier, something quieter, the kind of silence that only comes when everyone present realizes they have just witnessed a line being drawn and crossed at the same time, and Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it without the shield he had relied on minutes earlier, because the system had already moved past him, already reassigned what he thought he controlled, and now all that remained was the reality of his decisions laid bare in front of people who had seen every second unfold. And the younger staff member stepped slightly to the side of the terminal, no longer positioning herself behind him, but beside the system itself, her posture reflecting a shift that had nothing to do with instruction and everything to do with alignment, because authority had made itself clear and it was not standing where it had been before. And Darius Cole remained still, composed, his presence no longer questioned, no longer measured against appearance or assumption, but understood in full. And one of the guests near the entrance let out a slow breath before speaking, this time not quietly, not to a companion, but openly into the space. "You tried to remove the wrong man," he said, and the statement did not accuse, it confirmed, and that confirmation spread through the room like a quiet agreement, because everyone had seen it. Everyone had felt the shift from the first dismissive glance to the final system override, and Ethan's shoulders dropped just slightly, not in defeat, but in recognition, because there was nothing left to hold up, nothing left to defend. And he looked at Darius again, this time without the filter he had used before, without the assumptions that had guided his earlier decisions. And for a brief moment, he seemed to search for something to say, something that could reshape the moment. But there was no language left for that, because the moment had already been defined, and Darius broke the silence. Not loudly, not forcefully, but with a clarity that cut deeper than anything said before. "You did not question the system," he said. "You replaced it with your own judgment." And the words landed with precision, because they did not just describe what had happened. They explained why it mattered, why it extended beyond a single interaction at a door. And Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping for a fraction of a second before returning. And when he spoke, his voice was different, not authoritative, not defensive, just honest in a way it had not been before. "I thought I was doing my job," he said, and the sentence hung there, not as an excuse, but as a realization, and Darius nodded once, acknowledging it without accepting it as justification. "Your job is not to decide who fits," he replied. "It is to follow what is already defined." And that distinction settled into the space with finality, because it removed interpretation, removed bias, removed everything that had led to this moment in the first place. And the terminal chimed again, one final update, and the younger staff member glanced down before speaking clearly, her voice steady and unhesitant. "Manager access fully revoked," she said. And there it was, not dramatic, not loud, but absolute. The final step in a process that had been set in motion the moment Darius chose. Not to argue, not to react, but to let the system reveal the truth. And a quiet ripple moved through the guests. Not applause, not celebration, but recognition, the kind that comes when justice is not declared but demonstrated. And Ethan stepped back fully this time. No longer the center of the doorway, no longer the gatekeeper he had positioned himself as, but simply a man standing in front of the consequences of his own decisions. And Darius reached for the black card on the podium, lifting it with the same calm precision he had shown from the beginning, not as a symbol of victory, not as a statement, but as something that had always belonged to him. And he looked at Ethan one last time, his expression unchanged, his tone steady. The problem was never access, he said. It was assumption. And with that, the moment settled into its final shape, not chaotic, not loud, but clear, the kind of clarity that does not fade when people leave the room, the kind that stays, that reshapes how the next person is seen, how the next decision is made. And as Darius turned slightly toward the entrance, the space that had once been closed to him now open without question, the room did not follow him with doubt. It followed him with understanding, because what had just happened was not just a reversal, it was a correction, and everyone present knew it. The doorway did not feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like a threshold that had already been crossed before anyone physically moved, because the real shift had not happened when Darius stepped forward. It had happened when the system corrected itself, when authority realigned with truth instead of assumption. And now the space that had once been guarded with quiet judgment stood open without resistance. And Darius walked forward with the same steady pace he had carried from the beginning. Not faster, not slower, just consistent. His presence no longer questioned by anyone watching, because there was nothing left to question. And as he passed the podium, the younger staff member stepped aside fully, not out of obligation, but out of recognition, her posture reflecting something deeper than instruction, something closer to respect. And she met his eyes for a brief moment before saying, "Welcome, sir." Her voice clear, grounded, free of the hesitation that had defined her earlier. Words, and Darius gave a small nod in return, not as acknowledgement of the greeting, but as acknowledgement of the shift she had made, because change does not always come from power. Sometimes it comes from awareness, and she had chosen to see, and that mattered. And behind them, Ethan Caldwell remained where he stood, no longer positioned as the point of control, no longer directing movement or decisions, but simply present in the space he had once dominated, his expression quiet, his posture no longer rigid, because there was nothing left to hold in place, and the guests who had gathered near the entrance did not disperse immediately. They remained for a moment longer, watching not for drama, not for confrontation, but for completion, for the final alignment of what they had just witnessed. And one of them spoke again, this time, with a tone that carried both clarity and reflection. "This is how it should work," he said, and the statement did not seek agreement. It confirmed it, because everyone present had seen what happened when it did not, and what happened when it was corrected. And Darius continued into the main lounge, the soft lighting reflecting off polished wood and glass, the low hum of conversation slowly returning as the room adjusted to the restored rhythm. But even as normalcy began to settle back in, something had changed, something that would not reset as easily as the system had, because the people who witnessed this moment would carry it with them, the understanding that power does not always announce itself, that authority does not always look the way it is expected to, and that assumptions can dismantle structure faster than any external threat. And near the entrance, the younger staff member turned back to the terminal, her hands steady now as she navigated the interface with renewed attention, not out of fear of making a mistake, but out of awareness of what those mistakes could mean. And she glanced once more at Ethan, not with judgment, but with a quiet distance that had not been there before, because respect, once lost, does not return on command. It rebuilds slowly, if at all. And Ethan lowered his gaze briefly before looking back at the screen, the reality of the moment settling deeper with each passing second, not as a single event, but as a turning point, something that would define how he understood his role moving forward, if he chose to continue at all. And inside the lounge, Darius moved through the space without drawing attention to himself. No announcement, no display, just presence, the same presence that had been dismissed minutes earlier, now integrated seamlessly into the environment that had always belonged to him. And a server approached quietly, offering a glass of water with a respectful nod, and Darius accepted it with a simple thank you, his tone consistent, his demeanor unchanged, because nothing about his behavior had needed to change. Only the perception of it had, and that distinction lingered in the air long after the initial tension had dissolved. And back at the entrance, the final system update completed, the terminal screen settling into a new configuration, one that reflected the corrected structure, the reassigned authority, the removal of misused control. And the younger staff member exhaled slowly, not from relief, but from clarity, because the system now matched what it was supposed to represent, and that alignment carried a quiet sense of order, the kind that does not demand attention, but holds it nonetheless. And for everyone who had stood there just minutes before, the lesson did not need to be explained. It had been demonstrated in full, from the first dismissive word to the final system correction, a complete arc that left no room for interpretation, only understanding. The lounge returned to its rhythm slowly, not as if nothing had happened, but as if everything that had happened had settled into place, becoming part of the foundation rather than a disruption to it. And Darius Cole sat near the far end of the room, where the lights softened against the glass walls, the city stretching beyond in clean lines and distant motion, a view that had not changed, only the way it had been accessed. And he placed the untouched glass of water on the table in front of him, not out of distraction, but with the same deliberate control that had defined every movement since he arrived, because nothing about this moment required urgency, not anymore. And across the room, conversations resumed, quieter at first, measured, as if people were still adjusting to what they had witnessed, still processing the difference between assumption and reality. And a man who had been near the entrance earlier approached slowly, not intruding, but intentional, stopping at a respectful distance before speaking, I have been a member here for 10 years, he said, his tone calm, but reflective, and I have never seen anything like that. And Darius looked up, meeting his gaze without tension, without defensiveness, just presence. And he nodded once, not in agreement or disagreement, but in acknowledgement, because the statement was not about him. It was about the system that had just revealed itself. And the man continued, I guess I never noticed how things worked until now. And that was the part that mattered. Not the incident itself, but the awareness it created, the quiet shift in perspective that does not fade when the moment ends. And Darius leaned back slightly, his voice even. Most systems do not fail loudly, he said. They fail quietly, through the people trusted to run them. And the words settled between them, with clarity, not accusatory, not emotional, just true. And the man nodded slowly before stepping back, not needing more, because the explanation did not require elaboration. It had already been demonstrated in full. And near the entrance, the younger staff member continued her work, but her posture had changed, her movements more precise, more intentional, as if each action now carried a deeper understanding of its impact. And every time a guest approached, she looked at them directly, not scanning, not assuming, just seeing. And that difference, though subtle, reshaped the interaction in ways that could not be measured by policy alone. And Ethan Caldwell stood further back now, no longer positioned at the threshold, his role suspended not just by the system, but by the weight of what had happened. And he watched the flow of guests with a different expression, one that did not attempt to control, but to understand, because once a pattern is exposed, it cannot be unseen, and that exposure becomes a choice, to ignore it or to change. And the choice does not come with noise. It comes with quiet accountability, the kind that follows you long after the moment has passed. And Darius sat in that space without claiming it, without drawing attention to himself, because he had never come there to prove anything. He had come to reveal something, and now that it had been revealed, there was nothing left to assert, nothing left to correct, only the continuation of a standard that had always existed but had not always been followed. And he stood after a few minutes, not abruptly, just with the same measured pace, and as he walked toward the interior hallway, a server stepped aside with a respectful nod, not exaggerated, not performative, just natural, because respect that is understood does not need to be displayed. It simply exists. And as he moved further into the club, the earlier tension became something else entirely, not forgotten, but transformed into awareness, the kind that lingers in the background of every future interaction, shaping it in ways that are not always visible, but always present. And before turning the corner out of sight, Darius paused for a brief moment, not looking back at the entrance, not revisiting what had happened, but letting the space settle around him as it was now, aligned, corrected, functioning as it was meant to. And he spoke quietly, not to anyone in particular, but in a tone that carried just enough to be heard by those closest. I did not come here to raise my voice, he said. I came here to raise the standard. And the sentence did not echo. It did not need to, because it matched everything that had already taken place, every choice, every moment of restraint, every step that had led to a resolution built not on reaction, but on truth. And with that, he continued forward, leaving behind not just a corrected system, but a room full of people who now understood exactly what that standard meant.